I speak to you in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. You can tell that the weather is getting warmer and more humid. The little plastic cage I wear over my mouth is starting to get that condensation thing. I wonder what my dermatologist would say about that in COVID times, right? It is so good to see, now we don't have just 6 people. I think I see 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 11 people in the pews, plus our tech guys way in the back. So it's so fabulous to see you all, and again, thank you for being here, for being flexible, for learning, for giving feedback, all of that stuff that's happening as we start to return to a new pattern. God says, behold, I make all things new, right? Next week when we're open and we have the ability to have more people in here, it's going to be a lot of the same and a lot that is different. Because we're not all the way done with COVID, but at least we're getting closer. Things are getting better, so we really should be celebrating that. I'm thankful also for the people who are watching from home or on your device or wherever you are located. There may even be some people that are tuning in from vacation, so you guys get extra points. This is part of God renewing the church, not just Trinity Church, but church all together. We have had conversations at various levels in the church, from conversations at coffee hour and Bible study, all the way over to clergy conversations, all the way over to conventions, about how the church is in this sort of growing pain stage. We've been talking about this and the need for change for decades. I have been in the presence of bishops and the presiding bishop talking about how something new is coming. Now, nobody could have predicted COVID necessarily, but it seems that this is a time that God is doing something new and exciting. And part of this transition is looking for the blessing that has been tucked away in these terrible last months, this terrible year and a half that we've all been through, that we've journeyed through as a community, remembering that God is faithful, believing that God is here. And that predictor of change always brings with it some anxiety. Can you imagine how the disciples felt seeing Jesus raised from the dead, and then seeing him ascend into heaven, and then being told to wait? Well, wait for what? What is happening? What is coming? What is next? And there was no way to fast forward through that experience, like there's no way to fast forward through our experiences right now. All they could do is wait and pray and remember that Jesus promised that there was something more coming. Jesus reassured them that he had to leave, he had to get out of the way so that the church could grow. He had to teach them that this was now their church, their ministry of God, and that he would be with them, but not in the same way, that he had to make room for the Holy Spirit. And in the midst of that anxiety, the midst of that loss, of that confusion, of that not knowing what is happening, all they could do as they waited and prayed was remember God's past faithfulness. And that's where we get our reading from the prophet Ezekiel today. Today we get this reminder that God can do anything. That God can take dried out old bones that are not just fallen soldiers, they're not just dead bodies, they're not just even in some stage of rot. Nice. They are fully dead, dried out, old bones. And God says to Ezekiel, mortal, can these bones live? And Ezekiel says, I have no idea, that is not my department. Oh Lord, you know. I'm not even going to venture a guess because I'm going to look foolish. And then God says, prophesy to the bones. I cannot think of a more useless task. I'm reminded of a time a few years ago when I was walking my dog out. It was the one time I walked on that, on the west side of town, there's that sort of country road that goes past the Lutheran church from a family fair, and you swings around behind the funeral home. I was training for the Camino, so I wanted a longer walk, so I took Casey out and we were walking, and it was just too much traffic. I was worried because of that narrow kind of country highway that something would happen. But as we walked, we passed this, I think it was a dead dog that you could see. I actually took a picture of it, not because I'm morbid, but I was fascinated. You could see the bleached white bones that were becoming exposed by the turkey vultures and the other scavengers. Now, if God told me to prophesy to that, I would laugh. I hope that eventually I would do it. I mean, I hope I'm faithful enough that I would believe that God had something going on. But at least inside, I'd be like, you're kidding. Nothing's going to happen there. God says to Ezekiel, prophesy to the bones. And Ezekiel does. And the most horrifying thing I can imagine starts happening. The bones start moving. They start coming together, and they start rebuilding themselves from the inside out, bone to bone, sinew, skin, all this stuff. Not just bang, and there's a flash of light, and then there's a perfectly, reasonably formed human there. No, the description that is there is terrifying. And these masses of people are suddenly standing there waiting to have the breath of life breathed into them. And Ezekiel is told, prophesy to the breath. And he does, and they live. And God says this was all to show you and to show the people of Israel that hope is not lost now or ever. These are the people of Israel. They say our bones are dried up and our hope is lost. We are cut off completely. Has anybody felt dry in the last, 16 months? Has anybody felt lost? Has anybody felt cut off completely? But God is here, as God was there. We see these stories, we read these accounts to remind us that God is here now, that God has been faithful, is faithful, and will be faithful. That primes us, it gets us ready to receive the blessing when it happens. And it does to the disciples as they are waiting and praying. On the day of Pentecost, the Holy Spirit shows up with a sound like a mighty wind. And the gifts of the Spirit are poured out upon them, and it is confusing to everybody. The people that can hear and know what's going on say, how on earth is this happening? I'm from Pamphylia. They're speaking Pamphylian. How do they do that? I can see that they're Galileans. And on and on and on. Beautifully read by Jim. Thank you, Jim. Where are you? There you are, hiding behind the pulpit. They hear, and they are confused, but excited, but not all. Some say, well, they're drunk, because they're not able to hear the miracle that's there. And Peter gets up and says, no. It's only 9 in the morning. No way are we drunk. Although I have to wonder. He says, this is the gift from God. This is the fulfillment of the prophecy. This is a new beginning. Now, why do we read these things? We read them to remind us, no matter where we are, no matter what our struggle is, again, that God has been faithful, is faithful, and will be faithful. And we read these especially today, on the day that commemorates the time that the Holy Spirit came and the church was born, to remind us that God is with us. Now, that doesn't mean that every choice that we make is the right choice. It doesn't mean that every decision we make as a church is a good decision. But it inoculates us, if you can forgive a modern term, from that fear that God will abandon us. Because nothing we can do will drive God away. God may be standing right next to me at my worst decision and say, "And stop it, don't do that." But God doesn't leave. On my best days, I hope that God is there cheering me on. But I know that that's not every moment, because I'm human, just like you. And you can probably think of times in your life where you thought that you were alone, that God was gone. And now, with the benefit of hindsight, you might be able to look back and say, well, God wasn't gone. God was there. God and I might have been fighting about whatever was going on in my life, but God wasn't gone. We are a church of God's people. We are God's human family, and God is with us. Now, the trick is always to be talking with God, not to just set it and forget it, right? Not to just put God on a shelf and say, well, I have God now, and God is with me, and Mother Ann said God won't abandon me, so I can go do whatever I want. We need to keep praying and keep listening. Keep asking God, what does God want us to do? And then wait for an answer. There are times when we need to wait, and those times are excruciating. It is so much easier to be busy. I will tell you, this last year and a half has been really hard for me. It's been excruciating to be cut off from my flock, my congregation, but I've been busy. And that busyness on your behalf, doing things like these videos for you, have made me a happier camper. That is different than other people who really can only sit and wait. God is calling us to hear each other. It is no mistake that the miracle on the day of Pentecost is one of communication. That the disciples started to proclaim the works of God's power in languages they had never seen before. And that the people there were able to hear. People will sometimes ask, was the day of Pentecost a miracle of the tongue, or was it a miracle of the ear? In other words, was it a miracle that people could suddenly speak these languages, or was the miracle that was happening the fact that the people around them could suddenly hear them? Maybe the disciples were speaking in Greek or in Aramaic or in Hebrew, and the people from the other areas were just hearing their own language. And the answer is probably a yes and. A both and. Both things happening. So as we go out into the world, as we try to redefine and regather and reassemble who we are as Trinity Church in this stage of taking leave of COVID, who are we? What miracles is God showering out upon us? What ways are we reaching out that would be beyond our normal capabilities? What miracles of the tongue are God pouring out upon us right now? And what miracles of the ear are we receiving as well? How are we hearing each other? As people of Trinity and as citizens of the world. What experiences are we hearing about and sharing that suddenly are creating a connection with someone that you never would have thought you could have something in common with? You want a common denominator? COVID has pretty much done it for us, hasn't it? Now, it hasn't affected us all in the same way. We haven't all coped with it the same way. Some of us haven't coped at all. Some of us have experienced death, loss of job, loss of income, loss of identity, loss of church. There's a lot of loss. But in that, God is still with us. So let's be bold in sharing our stories and be brave in how we listen to others and look for that connection facilitated by the Holy Spirit. And remember, there is not a single person on the planet ever that is beyond God's reach. So whatever person just entered your mind, well, what about so-and-so? What about this group? What about that person? Yeah, them too. So how is God calling you to bear witness to the works of power that God is showering down on all of humanity? A lot of places celebrate the day of Pentecost as the birthday of the church. I've heard of churches where they have birthday cake. Now, we're not doing birthday cake. But how is Trinity being reborn now? What fear do you have that makes you want to say that it's impossible? Give a try putting that fear aside. Push it out of the way. Because I promise you, there is no fear that you ever experience that is bigger than God. And those times when we feel alone, God is here. God doesn't abandon us. God has been faithful, is faithful, and will be faithful. And thank God there is not a single thing we can do about it. Amen. I'd like to invite the